August 1942, a city on the banks of the Volga River burns beneath the endless roar of artillery. The air smells of smoke, blood, and metal. From above, German bombers carve the skyline into ash. On the ground, Soviet civilians and soldiers fight not just for a city, but for survival itself. This was Stalingrad, a name that would soon become synonymous with both unimaginable suffering and unbreakable will. In less than 7 months, over 2 million people would die here. But from this devastation, history would turn. The myth of Nazi invincibility would shatter, and the tide of the Second World War would begin to shift. It all started when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. He unleashed the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union across a front stretching 1,800 miles. His plan was simple: destroy the Red Army in a matter of months, seize Moscow, and crush communism before winter arrived. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Millions were captured. Cities like Kiev and Smolensk fell in weeks. German propaganda spoke of a lightning victory. But as the months dragged on, the blitzkrieg began to slow. The vast distances, brutal weather, and fierce Soviet resistance turned the campaign into a war of exhaustion. By the winter of 1941, German troops reached the outskirts of Moscow, but they would go no farther. Temperatures dropped to -40°C. Weapons froze. Soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains and newspapers for warmth. The Red Army counterattacked, pushing the Germans back from the capital. For the first time, Hitler's army had failed to win a major campaign. And yet, rather than retreat, Hitler doubled down. He believed the Soviet Union was wounded, that one final strike could finish the job on paper, and the target Stalingrad was just another industrial city, home to about 500,000 people, known for its factories and steelworks. But its name carried power. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, the Soviet leader. Capturing Stalingrad would be both a strategic and psychological victory. Strategically, it guarded the Volga River, a vital lifeline connecting the southern oil fields of the Caucasus to the rest of the Soviet Union. If the Germans could take it, they'd cut off Soviet transport and supply routes, crippling the Red Army's ability to fight. Psychologically, it was symbolic. Hitler wanted to humiliate Stalin by destroying the city named after him. In the summer of 1942, he launched Operation Blue, directing German armies toward the rich oil fields of southern Russia and toward Stalingrad. But Hitler made a fatal mistake. He divided his forces. Instead of focusing on one decisive blow, he sent part of his army south to seize oil and another east to capture Stalingrad. This split would stretch his lines thin, a weakness the Soviets would later exploit with devastating precision. On August 23, 1942, the first wave of Luftwaffe bombers descended upon Stalingrad. Within hours, entire districts were reduced to rubble. Wooden houses exploded into flames. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single day. The city that once stood tall along the Volga was now a wasteland of shattered concrete and twisted metal. But despite the destruction, the Soviet government ordered that not a step back be taken. Every man and woman still alive was mobilized. Factory workers picked up rifles. Nurses carried ammunition. Even school children dug trenches. As one survivor recalled, "We had no city left, only ruins, but we would fight for every brick, every street, every basement." The Germans, led by General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, advanced block by block. They expected the city to fall in days. Instead, it became a nightmare of close quarters. There were no front lines, only chaos. Every building became a fortress, every room a battlefield. Soviet snipers hunted from shattered windows. German soldiers fought for staircases and hallways. Both sides suffered heavy losses for gains measured in meters, not miles. The Soviets developed a grim tactic known as hugging the enemy, fighting so close to German lines that their own artillery couldn't target them without risking friendly fire. It forced the technologically superior German forces into brutal hand-to-hand combat, where tanks and aircraft offered little help. Soviet commander Vasily Zaitsev, leading the 62nd Army, famously declared, "Time is blood. We will hold the enemy by the throat and bleed him dry." This was not a traditional battle. It was an urban hell. By October 1942, the city of Stalingrad was a graveyard. Smoke hung over the ruins like a permanent night. The Volga River, once a lifeline for Soviet supplies, was now a killing zone. German artillery shelled any boat daring to cross. The 62nd Army, under General Vasily Zaitsev, was cut off, but not broken. His men clung to a few hundred meters of land on the western bank. Behind them, there was nowhere to retreat, only the river. Soviet High Command, known as Stavka, watched the situation closely. To the Germans, Stalingrad seemed almost conquered. But Stalin and his generals were planning something much larger, something that would change the course of the entire war. The Soviets had spent months quietly building reserves, far from the front. Fresh divisions, new tanks, and Siberian troops hardened by the cold. The Germans didn't notice, or didn't care, convinced that the city would soon fall. As autumn turned to winter, temperatures plunged. Snow covered the ruins, and frostbite claimed more men than bullets. But amid the frozen silence, a storm was brewing, one that would engulf the German army completely. Capturing Stalingrad would be both a strategic and psychological victory. Strategically, it guarded the Volga River, a vital lifeline connecting the southern oil fields of the Caucasus to the rest of the Soviet Union. If the Germans could take it, they'd cut off Soviet transport and supply routes, crippling the Red Army's ability to fight. Psychologically, it was symbolic. Hitler wanted to humiliate Stalin by destroying the city named after him. In the summer of 1942, he launched Operation Blue, directing German armies toward the rich oil fields of southern Russia and toward Stalingrad. But Hitler made a fatal mistake. He divided his forces. Instead of focusing on one decisive blow, he sent part of his army south to seize oil and another east to capture Stalingrad. This split would stretch his lines thin, a weakness the Soviets would later exploit with devastating precision. On August 23, 1942, the first wave of Luftwaffe bombers descended upon Stalingrad. Within hours, entire districts were reduced to rubble. Wooden houses exploded into flames. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in a single day. The city that once stood tall along the Volga was now a wasteland of shattered concrete and twisted metal. But despite the destruction, the Soviet government ordered that not a step back be taken. Every man and woman still alive was mobilized. Factory workers picked up rifles. Nurses carried ammunition. Even school children dug trenches. As one survivor recalled, "We had no city left, only ruins, but we would fight for every brick, every street, every basement." The Germans, led by General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, advanced block by block. They expected the city to fall in days. Instead, it became a nightmare. 19th, 1942, at exactly 7:30 a.m., the quiet was broken by the thunder of 3,500 Soviet guns. The ground shook as artillery opened up across a 30-mile front north of Stalingrad. This was Operation Uranus, the Soviet counterattack designed to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. But instead of attacking the well-fortified German center, the Soviets struck the flanks, held not by German troops, but by their weaker allies, the Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians. These Axis units were poorly equipped and ill-prepared for the winter offensive. Many had no winter uniforms and outdated weapons. Within hours, their defenses collapsed. Soviet T-34 tanks poured through the gaps, crushing resistance. Infantry followed in waves, overwhelming bunkers and trenches. The Germans soon realized the unthinkable. They were being surrounded. 3 days later, a second Soviet front attacked from the south. By November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap was complete. More than 300,000 German soldiers, along with thousands of Romanians and other Axis troops, were now trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler's greatest army was surrounded. When news of the encirclement reached Hitler, he refused to believe it. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and incompetence. He ordered General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, to stand fast. Stalingrad must not be surrendered. The army will hold its position at all costs. Paulus, a cautious and obedient officer, followed orders. He believed Hitler's promise that supplies would come by air, that the Luftwaffe could deliver enough food, fuel, and ammunition to sustain his troops. But this was a fantasy. The Sixth Army needed over 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could deliver, at best, 100 tons, often much less due to Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The situation grew desperate. Fuel ran out. Wounded men froze to death in field hospitals. Horses were slaughtered for food. A German soldier wrote in his diary, "We eat the same soup every day. Water, frozen meat, and hope." The once mighty Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was starving to death inside a frozen tomb. Hitler's generals begged for permission to break out. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, proposed a rescue mission, Operation Winter Storm. In December 1942, Manstein's forces launched an offensive from the south, striking toward Stalingrad. At first they advanced rapidly, breaking through Soviet lines. For a brief moment it seemed salvation was near. German troops inside the pocket could hear the distant rumble of artillery. Their comrades were only 30 miles away, but Paulus never moved. He had strict orders from Hitler: hold the city, do not retreat. By the time Manstein realized Paulus would not act without permission, it was too late. The Soviet front regrouped and slammed the door shut. Operation Winter Storm had failed. The Sixth Army was now doomed. By January 1943, temperatures plunged below -25 degrees Celsius. Soldiers burned furniture to stay warm. Ammunition froze in machine guns. The once organized German lines had disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance. Men fought with desperation, not for victory but for survival. Starvation led to madness. There were reports of cannibalism, of men fighting each other over scraps of bread. The Soviets, now fully in control of the battlefield, tightened their grip day by day. They broadcast surrender appeals through loudspeakers. German soldiers, every minute you stay here is another minute closer to death. Surrender and you will live. Most ignored it. Others simply had no strength left to move. Forces entered the final ruins. They found a nightmare. Tens of thousands of corpses frozen in the snow, shattered tanks, and starving survivors too weak to stand. Of the 300,000 German troops trapped inside the city, on January 31st, 1943, General Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad. 2 days later, the northern group followed. When Soviet forces entered the final ruins, they found a nightmare. Tens of thousands of corpses frozen in the snow, shattered tanks, and starving survivors too weak to stand. Of the 300,000 German troops trapped inside the city, only 91,000 surrendered. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The defeat at Stalingrad shocked the world. For the first time, Nazi Germany had suffered a catastrophic, undeniable loss. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. Even Hitler's closest allies began to doubt the future of the war. German morale plummeted. The Soviet Union, once on the brink of collapse, now surged forward with renewed confidence. In the months that followed, Soviet armies advanced westward, reclaiming cities and pushing the Germans out of Russian territory. Stalingrad had not only saved the Soviet Union, it had marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. As Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin declared, "The Red Army has broken the back of the fascist beast." But victory came at an unimaginable cost. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians died in and around the city. Entire generations were wiped out. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a grave. When the fighting finally stopped in February 1943, the city of Stalingrad no longer existed. What had once been home to over 500,000 people was now nothing more than shattered stone and human remains. Entire districts were erased from the map. The Volga River, once the artery of the city, was clogged with wreckage. Boats sunk, bridges destroyed, corpses frozen in the ice. The air still carried the stench of death and burning oil for months after. Soviet recovery teams moved through the ruins, burying the dead, and rescuing the few who somehow survived in cellars and basements. Some hadn't seen daylight for months, surviving on melted snow and scraps of food. One Soviet medic recalled, "We found them huddled in darkness, pale as ghosts. Some didn't even believe the battle was over." For those who lived, survival brought little comfort. Mothers searched for children who never returned. Soldiers wandered through the ruins, unable to recognize their own neighborhoods. Stalingrad had been defended to the last man, and nearly every man had fallen. Forces entered the final ruins. They found a nightmare. Tens of thousands of corpses frozen in the snow, shattered tanks, and starving survivors too weak to stand. Of the 300,000 German troops trapped inside the city, meanwhile, only 91,000 the remnants surrendered. Of the German Sixth Army were marched into captivity. Those who surrendered were in horrific condition, frostbitten, starving, covered in lice. Many were little more than walking skeletons. The Soviet guards, hardened by months of brutality, showed little mercy. They had seen their own families killed and their cities destroyed. The journey to the POW camps was a death march. Thousands died on the way, collapsing in the snow from exhaustion or hunger. Some were shot for falling behind. Of the 91,000 German soldiers captured, only about 5,000 to 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest perished in Soviet captivity. For Hitler, the loss was unthinkable. He refused to publicly acknowledge the defeat for weeks. In his eyes, Paulus had betrayed him by surrendering instead of fighting to the death. But the truth was far simpler. The Sixth Army had been sacrificed to Hitler's pride. Chapter 13. The Anatomy of a Defeat. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just a military disaster. It was a lesson in arrogance. Hitler's obsession with taking the city named after his enemy blinded him to logic. He ignored his generals' warnings, split his forces, and underestimated both the Soviets and the Russian winter. Mistakes eerily similar to Napoleon's a century earlier. The Luftwaffe, already overextended, could never have supplied an entire army trapped behind enemy lines. And yet, Hitler insisted, believing that sheer willpower could defy mathematics. Meanwhile, Stalin, often criticized for his brutality, made one of his rare strategic masterstrokes. By allowing the Germans to overextend and then encircling them, he turned their strength into weakness. It was a demonstration of a timeless truth in warfare. An army that believes itself invincible is already half defeated. Stalingrad was also a story of human endurance, of what people can survive and what they can become under impossible conditions. Civilians hid in underground tunnels while the world above them burned. Families boiled wallpaper for glue to make soup. Soldiers fought without ammunition, resorting to bayonets, bricks, or bare hands. A Red Army sniper named Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of many women who fought, said, "In Stalingrad, we stopped counting the dead. We only counted the living because there were so few left." Both sides committed acts of heroism and horror. German medics treated wounded Soviets in the chaos, while Soviet soldiers risked their lives to deliver bread across sniper-filled streets. But there were also executions, burnings, and cruelty beyond measure. Stalingrad was not just a battlefield. It was a place where humanity itself was tested. When news of the Soviet victory reached the world, everything changed. In London and Washington, people celebrated. In Berlin, there was silence. For the first time, the German people began to doubt Hitler's promises of eternal victory. The war's momentum shifted completely. Within months, the Red Army launched new offensives, reclaiming Kharkov, Kursk, and eventually pushing west toward Poland and Germany itself. Stalingrad became a symbol of sacrifice, resilience, and revenge. Every Soviet soldier who fought afterward carried that symbol in his heart. Even Hitler's generals later admitted that after Stalingrad, the question was no longer if Germany would lose. Stalingrad became sacred ground in the Soviet Union. Monuments rose from the ashes, none more famous than the Motherland calls, a colossal statue towering over the city of Volgograd as it was renamed in 1961. For decades, veterans returned to the site to lay flowers, weep, and remember. To them, Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was a scar. Every Russian family had someone who fought or died there. Even today, the word Stalingrad evokes a mix of pride and pain. In Germany, it became a national trauma, a symbol of the dangers of blind obedience and the insanity of total war. German survivors, haunted for life, described the battle as the day God left the earth. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad wasn't won by better weapons or even better strategy. It was won by endurance, by the will to suffer longer than the enemy could imagine. But the cost was unbearable. Cities like Stalingrad remind us that behind every turning point in history lies a mountain of human suffering. The Germans lost an army, the Soviets lost a generation, and the world lost a part of its innocence. War is often remembered in numbers, divisions, tanks, casualties, but Stalingrad should be remembered in faces, the faces of starving children in basements, of frozen soldiers clutching rifles, of nurses whispering last prayers. It showed the best and worst of humanity, courage and cruelty, sacrifice and madness, all compressed into one city on the Volga River. As one Soviet veteran said decades later at Stalingrad, we fought not for victory, but for existence. We became animals, and then, somehow, we became human again. The Battle of Stalingrad changed everything. From that frozen battlefield, the tide of World War II began to turn. The Red Army marched west, liberating Europe one ruined city at a time. For Hitler, it marked the beginning of his downfall. For the Soviets, it was proof that no invader, no matter how powerful, could break the will of a people, defending their home. But the deeper truth of Stalingrad is universal. When ambition blinds reason and pride silences compassion, destruction follows. Whether in war, politics, or life, Stalingrad is a warning carved in stone and blood. The city that refused to die became the symbol of humanity's darkest hour. September 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a burning carcass, its skyline erased by weeks of Luftwaffe bombing. Smoke choked the horizon. The Volga River, once the lifeline of Soviet industry, now shimmered with oil slicks and debris. The Germans believed the Soviets were finished. They were wrong. The German advance on August 23, 1942, over 1,000 German aircraft carpet-bombed Stalingrad. In a single day, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Apartment blocks crumbled into dust, tram lines melted into the streets, and entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath rubble. When the smoke cleared, the Wehrmacht moved in, expecting victory within days. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, was ordered to take the city at all costs. His mission was clear: secure the Volga, cut off Soviet transport routes, and crush morale by capturing the city bearing Stalin's name. But as German tanks rolled forward, they found themselves in a maze of destruction. Every building was a fortress, every basement a bunker. The Red Army had no intention of giving up. The Soviet response, Stalin had already issued Order Number 227. Not one step back. Retreat was now treason. Behind the front lines, NKVD troops were stationed to shoot any soldier who tried to flee. For many, the only way forward was through death. Under General Vasily Zaitsev, commander of the 62nd Army, the Soviet defense transformed into something brutal and primal. Zaitsev's strategy was simple but deadly. Fight the Germans up close. He called it hugging the enemy. By staying just meters from the German lines, Zaitsev neutralized their air superiority and artillery advantage. Bombs couldn't be dropped without risking friendly fire. This turned the battle into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Fought in factories, became a patchwork of death zones. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Every street was a front line. Every window could hide a sniper. Every corner could be the last thing a soldier ever saw. Buildings changed hands multiple times a day. The famous Pavlov's house, defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his platoon, held off German assaults for nearly 2 months without relief. They turned a simple apartment block into a fortress with machine gun nests, barbed wire, and anti-tank rifles poking through the walls. The Germans, armed with tanks and flamethrowers, tried again and again to take it. They failed. By now, Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a personal duel between Hitler and Stalin. For Hitler, losing was unthinkable. For Stalin, surrendering was impossible. As the weeks dragged on, the living conditions on both sides deteriorated into something unimaginable. In the Soviet lines, soldiers slept in bombed-out ruins, surrounded by corpses. They drank melted snow, ate rats, and fought beside the dead. The air was thick with the smell of decay. On the German side, morale began to crumble. Paulus's troops had expected victory within weeks. Instead, they were trapped in endless street battles with an enemy who refused to die. A German officer wrote in his diary, "The Russians are not men, they are some kind of iron devils," and indeed that's what they seemed like. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga under relentless bombardment. Many drowned, others were killed before reaching the shore. But still, they came. For Stalin, Stalingrad had become a symbol of survival itself. He poured every available man and bullet into the city in 1942. The situation had reached a stalemate. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding, and half-starved. The Germans controlled most of the city, but not all of it. Trikov and his men still held a narrow strip of land along the Volga River, barely a kilometer wide, but they refused to give it up. That sliver of ground became sacred. Soviet artillery from the eastern bank provided constant cover fire, blasting German positions day and night. But what the Germans didn't know was that far beyond the city, the Soviets were preparing something massive, a counterattack. In November 1942, the Red Army unleashed Operation Uranus. Instead of attacking the city directly, Soviet forces struck the weaker flanks of the German army, held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. They collapsed almost instantly. Within days, the Germans inside Stalingrad found themselves surrounded. The hunters had become the hunted. Paulus's Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was trapped. This was the fatal flaw of Hitler's strategy: arrogance. The Wehrmacht had been unstoppable for 3 years, crushing entire nations in weeks. They believed themselves invincible. But at Stalingrad, they met an enemy who couldn't afford to lose. The Soviets were defending their soil, their homes, their families. It's easy to see war as numbers, as maps with arrows and dates. But Stalingrad reminds us that war isn't fought by armies. It's fought by human beings pushed beyond reason. Men froze to death clutching rifles. Civilians starved in cellars, whispering prayers to a god who no longer answered. And yet, as the encirclement tightened, Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his position. The Sixth Army will stand fast. It will be supplied by air. But it was a delusion. The Luftwaffe promised 500 tons of supplies a day. They barely delivered 80. Fuel, food, ammunition. All ran out within weeks. By December, German soldiers were eating horse meat, bread made of sawdust, even the leather of their boots. Frostbite and disease spread faster than bullets. Outside the pocket, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted a rescue, Operation Winter Storm, but he never reached the city. The Soviet noose was too tight. Inside, Paulus's men began to realize they were doomed. By January 1943, temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The Sixth Army had no winter clothing. The Soviets launched their final offensive. Block by block, they advanced through the frozen ruins. German resistance collapsed. Whole divisions surrendered. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, hinting that no German officer of that rank had ever surrendered. Paulus understood the message: die fighting. But on February 2, 1943, he did the unthinkable. He surrendered. Out of 300,000 German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, only 91,000 were captured alive. Of those, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest perished in Soviet captivity, frozen, starved, or forgotten. For the Soviet Union, it was a Pyrrhic victory, nearly 1 million casualties. But Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. The unstoppable German war machine had finally been broken. From that point forward, it was the Red Army that advanced. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a test of will, of endurance, of faith, of madness. In the ruins of that city, the course of history shifted. It showed the world that even the strongest empire can collapse under the weight of its own pride. That sometimes victory isn't about who has the most weapons, but who refuses to give up. And it asked a question that still echoes through time. How much suffering can humanity endure in the name of survival? Stalingrad was both a graveyard and a rebirth, the city that died to save a nation. When the guns finally fell silent over Stalingrad, the silence felt unnatural, almost wrong. For months the city had lived to the rhythm of explosions. Now only the wind and the groans of the wounded remained. The once mighty Sixth Army was gone. The ruins were filled with the dead, Soviet and German alike. Frozen bodies lined the streets, half buried in snow, as if the city itself had swallowed them whole. In the aftermath, Soviet soldiers moved carefully through the rubble. They were victors, but they looked nothing like conquerors. Their faces were hollow, their hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Medical units tried to save what little life remained. In the basements of shattered buildings, the wounded begged for water. One Soviet medic recalled, "The living lay beside the dead. I could not tell who was sleeping and who was gone." Over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, had been killed, wounded, or captured during the battle. Entire families had vanished without a trace, and yet, amid that devastation, the Soviet Union claimed victory. For Stalin, Stalingrad became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of divine resistance. Posters appeared across the USSR, showing heroic soldiers raising the red flag over ruins. Radio broadcasts proclaimed, "Stalingrad has been cleansed of the fascist." Became legend. Schoolchildren memorized its heroes. Cities were renamed in honor of its defenders. But behind the propaganda was a simple truth: the Soviets had survived only by sacrificing everything. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a wound that never healed. In the years leading up to 1942, he had promised the German people that his armies were invincible, that the Reich would last 1,000 years. But after Stalingrad, that illusion shattered. The defeat broke something deeper than military power. It broke morale. Across Germany, whispers spread. Families of soldiers began receiving telegrams, missing in action. Factories went silent. Confidence faded. Hitler refused to admit the scale of the disaster. He blamed his generals, the weather, even fate, but never himself. Behind closed doors, he reportedly said, "The gods have turned away from me. Of the 91,000 German soldiers captured at Stalingrad, few would ever return. They marched east through the snow, starving, frostbitten, and beaten. Those who survived the journey found themselves in Soviet prison camps, places of hunger, disease, and slow decay. They became the forgotten ghosts of Stalingrad. For years after the war, families in Germany waited for sons and husbands who never came home. It wasn't until the 1950s that a handful of survivors returned, aged beyond recognition, carrying memories they could never speak aloud. Strategically, Stalingrad was the moment the war's tide turned. Before it, Germany still dreamed of victory. After it, survival became their only goal. The Wehrmacht lost not just men, but trust, momentum, and the myth of invincibility. The Red Army, on the other hand, grew stronger. Factories from the Ural Mountains poured out tanks, planes, and rifles at a scale the Germans could. The Soviets would push west, slowly, relentlessly, through Kursk, through Belarus, through Poland, all the way to Berlin. History often remembers battles by their generals: Napoleon at Waterloo, Caesar at Pharsalus. But Stalingrad was different. General Friedrich Paulus wasn't a monster or a fanatic. He was a methodical, cautious man. He had followed orders, even when those orders led to disaster. When he finally surrendered, he became the first German field marshal to do so in history. Many called him a coward. Others saw him as a man who refused to die for madness. In captivity, Paulus eventually denounced Hitler and testified against him at Nuremberg. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a man trying to reclaim his conscience after losing his army. On the Soviet side, General Vasily Zaitsev, who led the defense of the city, became a national hero. Years later, he would command a Soviet assault on Berlin, and when he died, he requested to be buried at Stalingrad, among the men who never left. In the years after the war, the city of Stalingrad, later renamed Volgograd, rose from its ashes. But rebuilding wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. The survivors carried invisible wounds. Some had lost entire families. Others, their sanity. The ruins of factories and apartment blocks were cleared, but beneath them lay layers of history, artifacts of horror and heroism intertwined. To this day, construction workers in Volgograd still uncover bones, helmets, and letters buried deep in the soil. The city itself remains a museum of memory. Stalingrad didn't just reshape the Eastern Front, it reshaped the entire world. After the battle, the Western Allies saw that the Soviet Union could truly stand against Nazi Germany. This realization changed everything, from wartime strategy to post-Normandy 2 years later. They knew the Germans were already bleeding out in the East. In many ways, Stalingrad had won the war before D-Day even began. But victory came at a cost that defied comprehension. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't merely a clash of armies, it was a collapse of humanity. Soldiers became animals, civilians vanished between explosions, even the victors came home haunted. It's said that after Stalingrad, no one came back the same. For the Soviets, victory was pride mixed with trauma. For the Germans, defeat was guilt wrapped in silence. Generations grew up under the shadow of that battle, some glorifying it, others trying to forget it ever happened. But the ghosts of Stalingrad never left. They linger in diaries, in letters, in the silent photographs of men who stare blankly into history. Stalingrad stands as a warning, a mirror reflecting the extremes of human will. It showed that courage and cruelty can live in the same heart, that discipline can lead to victory, but also to destruction, and that in the pursuit of domination, humanity itself is often the first casualty. Every empire believes it's unbreakable, until it meets its Stalingrad. The Romans had Cannae, Napoleon had Moscow, Hitler had Stalingrad. Each time ambition outgrew reason and paid the price. Today, Stalingrad is studied in every military academy around the world, not just for its tactics, but for its lessons. It teaches that logistics can decide fate, that morale can outlast machines, and that the human spirit, when cornered, can become stronger than any weapon. Yet beyond the analysis and maps, one truth remains. Stalingrad was not about who won or lost. When we speak of Stalingrad, we often think of numbers, casualties, divisions, tonnage. But behind each number was a heartbeat, a mother waiting by the Volga, a soldier staring at the frozen sky, a child whispering through the noise, hoping someone would answer. They were all part of this story, a story of death, endurance, and rebirth. And perhaps that's why Stalingrad endures, not as a tale of victory, but as a reminder that even in the darkest winters of history, the human spirit can still refuse to die. Time has a way of dulling pain, but some wounds never fade. Stalingrad is one of them. Even decades later, its ghosts still whisper through the pages of history, a haunting reminder of what happens when ambition blinds humanity. Today, the city once called Stalingrad is known as Volgograd. On the surface, it's peaceful, a river city filled with parks, bridges, and monuments. Children play where soldiers once died. Trams glide down streets rebuilt from rubble. But beneath that peace lies a quiet reverence, an understanding shared by all who live there, that this ground is sacred. The soil still hides bones, bullet casings, fragments of uniforms, silent witnesses to the horror that once unfolded. Every year, on February 2nd, the city falls silent. Candles are lit, and the air fills with the sound of church bells, the same bells that refused to ring during the battle. Standing atop Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that saw some of the fiercest fighting, is one of the largest statues in the world. She towers 85 meters high, sword raised, her face both fierce and sorrowful. To the Soviet Union, she symbolized victory. To the world, she became a symbol of defiance, the embodiment of endurance against annihilation. But for the soldiers who survived, that monument also represented something more personal, the memory of friends who never returned. After World War II, the legacy of Stalingrad shaped not just the Soviet identity, but the entire world. It became the cornerstone of national pride, proof that socialism had defeated fascism. For the West, it marked a moment when Soviet power became undeniable. The victory gave Stalin immense political capital, which he used to expand Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. By 1949, the same Soviet resilience that won Stalingrad was fueling the Cold War, an ideological standoff that would last nearly half a century. In a way, Stalingrad didn't just end one war, it began another. Every war leaves behind questions. For Stalingrad, the greatest one is about leadership and the cost of blind obedience. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat sealed the fate of 300,000 men. Paulus obeyed, even when he knew it meant destruction. It's a stark reminder that loyalty, when twisted by fanaticism, becomes tragedy. By contrast, Chuikov's command thrived on adaptability and desperation. His soldiers fought with what they had, often with nothing at all. He turned survival into a strategy, and in doing so changed the course of history. The lesson endures in war. Flexibility often wins where arrogance fails. Even after the guns fell silent, the real battle continued. inside the minds of those who lived through it. German prisoners carried guilt and confusion for the rest of their lives. Soviet veterans carried trauma, often unspoken, buried beneath medals and silence. Psychologists today describe it as moral injury, the breaking of one's sense of right and wrong. In Stalingrad, morality dissolved in the fire. Mercy was rare, hatred was routine, and yet humanity still flickered. Accounts tell of Soviet and German soldiers sharing cigarettes in the snow, exchanging glances. Modern military strategy still studies Stalingrad, not just for its tactics, but for its psychology. Urban warfare, counterinsurgency, and siege resilience cities all like draw lessons from Mariupol and Mosul bear eerie resemblances, proving that even with advanced technology, war in cities still becomes personal, chaotic, and devastating. Stalingrad teaches one core truth: when war enters a city, civilization itself becomes a casualty. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the story of Stalingrad evolved once again. For Russia, it remains a symbol of national strength and unity. For Germany, it became a solemn chapter, a story of loss and redemption through remembrance. Across the world, historians still debate the decisions made there. Was Stalingrad a military necessity or a political obsession? Did either side truly win, or did both simply lose less than the other? The answers depend on perspective, but the cost in human life remains the same. Behind every grand strategy were countless untold stories, moments too small for history books, yet vast in meaning. A Soviet nurse who carried wounded men through sniper fire, surviving on a single potato a day. A German radio operator who buried his best friend in frozen ground and carved his name into a rifle stock. A child who watched her house burn, clutching a doll made of rags, whispering. These voices remind us that history isn't written by generals. It's lived by ordinary people caught in impossible circumstances. Why do we still speak of Stalingrad? Because it forces us to confront what we're capable of, both the horror and the heroism. It shows how quickly civilization can crumble, how propaganda can turn men into monsters, and how, even in the ruins, compassion can survive. Remembering Stalingrad isn't about glorifying war. It's about understanding it. It's about seeing beyond flags and uniforms, and recognizing that the line between good and evil often runs through every human heart. The camera drifts over the modern skyline of Volgograd. Children play by the river. A fisherman casts his line where once soldiers crossed under fire. The sun sets over the Volga, golden, calm, eternal. And for a moment it's easy to forget that this peaceful place was once the edge of the world. The ruins are gone. The guns are silent. But history still breathes here, in the soil, in the river, in the silence of the wind. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in 1943, but its echoes still shape the conscience of humanity. In every generation there is a Stalingrad, a place where hope and horror meet, and what we choose to remember determines what kind of world we build next.